All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Equal Work, Equal Pay, Reducing the Gender Pay Gap, Civil Society Youth Briefing. My name is Cairo Eubanks, and I'm the Youth Representative for New Future Foundation to the United Nations and a proud member of the United Nations Department of Global Communications Youth Representatives Steering Committee. Across the globe, unfortunately, women have significantly received less compensation than men performing the same job. A World Bank 2019 report actually stated that only 6 countries globally pay women and men equally for the same job. I actually did a little bit of research, and as of a 2022 report by the World Bank, in the span of about 3 years, that number has only doubled from 6 countries to 12. And despite the realities of gender and race-based wage discrimination, disparities still exist, particularly for women of color whose intersectional identities render them susceptible to economic inequality. And that is why we are here today, to hear from expert panelists in the areas of labor and equal rights advocacy, human trafficking, prevention, AI technology, and the private sector as it relates to closing the gender pay gap. We have a truly well-rounded panel of experts, intergenerational, international, and intersectional. I personally cannot wait to hear from our speakers today. So for those who are just joining us, welcome, welcome, welcome. As you're coming in, please be sure to introduce yourself, your organization, and where you're coming from. And in the meantime, we will now hear from Hawa Diallo, Public Information Officer, Civil Society Unit for the Department of Global Communications. Hawa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Cairo. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I hope that everybody's doing well. As Cairo said, I am the Public Information Officer and Chief of the Civil Society Unit in the Department of Global Communications here at the UN headquarters in New York. It's so nice to be connecting to people virtually from all around the world, including our impressive lineup of speakers. Well, thanks for joining us today and joining this civil society briefing. It's a virtual side event of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. And as Cairo mentioned, it's focused on equal work, equal pay, and really looking at how we can reduce the gender pay gap. Now, much of the work that we do in the Civil Society Unit is focused on youth participation. In fact, one of the core missions of our office is to invest and empower young leaders in our pursuit of fostering civil society partnerships to promote the objectives that are fundamental in the UN Charter. Our youth-led events really give an opportunity, a unique opportunity for young people to take charge, to be leaders, and for their voices and insightful and transformative ideas to be actively listened to. And so that we can draw lessons and best practices from the many encounters that we have with them on UN platforms. I want to acknowledge the power that they have as young people in shaping a promising future for a better world. With regards to today's briefing, a major theme at the United Nations, and of course within civil society, is to continue to be deeply invested in gender equality and the promotion of rights of all women across all sectors of society. So the relevance of gender equality across borders and sectors cannot be understated. In fact, we know, as Cairo had said earlier, that women often are vulnerable to discrimination and gender-based inequities in unprecedented conditions, especially in times of the pandemic. We have to be able to clearly observe this reality, or I should say we have been able to clearly observe this reality within the context of the pandemic, as I mentioned, because women have received significantly less compensation than men for the same job, as alluded by our moderator, Cairo. And again, I'm going to repeat it because it's appalling that only 6 countries pay women at the same rate for equal work done by men. And of course, as we said, with the pandemic, this has even gotten, worse in all sort of ways. And it's delayed the progress, especially of women in the workplace. So today you will hear from an exceptional panel of speakers that are well-versed in gender wage equity. Our goal really is to address the successes in attaining equitable economic opportunities for women, and also to address the existing challenges that they still face. We understand that the reality of gender-based discrimination and inequality is more complex than what we see on the surface. So, as such, we find it equally important to emphasize the need to approach discussions on gender-based wage inequity from an intersectional perspective. And also considering the unique challenges and experiences that women have in different locations across ages, races, religions, as well as capabilities and their orientation. Every person has a unique experience, and so addressing different gender identities in interventions really ensures that no one is left behind and that everybody's specific needs are at least considered and that we, attempt to meet them. Let me stop right here because I'm sure, like me, you want to hear everything that this impressive cast of speakers has to say. So without further ado, I'm going to send it over back again to Cairo. Cairo, I don't know if you've caught on already. She's a dedicated and passionate leader in civil society. For me, what's really important is that she's an active and dynamic leader, member in the civil society unit's Youth Representative Steering Committee, which I manage. It's an awesome honor to really learn from you, Cairo, and to be working with you. So please take it away. Thank you so much, everybody.
Oh my goodness, Hawa, thank you so much. And I have to thank you so much for really championing this concept of intergenerational conversation and dialogue. I mean, the fact that you have me here, I'm so honored. And I have to say that I'm not even, at 26, I'm not even the youngest person who will be speaking today. You're going to be hearing from an incredible young man who's 18 years old. So without further ado, rather than just alluding to the panel discussion, we will now transition. So what I will do now is I will introduce each panelist who will present from their area of expertise. I know that many of you may already have questions. Let me tell you, I've already had a chance to speak with many of our speakers, and I already know that the question and answer portion of this event will truly be a rich discussion. So if you have a question for a speaker as they're presenting, please just write your name, the name of your organization, and the question that you have in the chat, so that our chat administrators can collect your questions. Please note that after the last presenter speaks, we will then have a question and answer where I will say your name, the name of your organization, and you will be invited to unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and ask our panelists your question directly. So without further ado, our first panelist is Lisa Wong Ramser. She is a senior specialist and non-discrimination representative for the International Labor Organization, the first and oldest specialized agency of the UN. Lisa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Cairo. And good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to everyone joining us here from all over the globe. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to have been invited to participate in this panel discussion today on equal work, equal pay, and reducing the gender pay gap. I too am truly looking forward to a passionate, interesting, and informative session with my esteemed panelists and all the wonderful participants who are joining us today. The interest in this topic of equal pay and the gender pay gap is really heartwarming for me, especially as we meet here on the fringes of the Commission on the Status of Women. So today, I'd like to focus my interventions around three key questions. Question number one, what does the normative framework say about equal work and equal pay? Question number two, what lies behind the gender pay gap? And finally, what is the international community doing to reduce the global gender pay gap? So let's start with my first question around the normative framework surrounding equal work and equal pay. First and foremost, allow me to emphasize that equal pay is a fundamental principle and right at work, and a recognized human right to which all women and men are entitled. Men and women should receive equal pay for doing work that is the same or similar, but they should also receive equal pay when they do work that is completely different, but which, based on objective criteria, is seen to be of equal value. So you see here, I'm introducing a different concept, okay? The concept of equal value. This concept of equal pay for work of equal value is not a recent one. The right to equal remuneration for women and men for work of equal value is enshrined in the ILO's constitution, which dates back to 1919. So we're talking here about over 100 years ago. And in 1951, some 70 years ago, the ILO adopted the Equal Remuneration Convention. That's its International Labour Convention number 100, which is the first international instrument on this important topic. It was no coincidence that the convention was adopted after the Second World War, as women were on the front line of production during the war in many countries. And this myth that women could not do certain jobs or were not as productive as men could no longer be sustained. So what is Convention 100 about, and what does it say? Firstly, it is important to note that this convention applies to all workers, both nationals and non-nationals. It applies to all sectors of activity. That means in the public and private sectors, and in the formal and informal economies. Specifically, the convention defines the term remuneration. It doesn't talk about pay, it talks about remuneration. Remuneration is not only about your pay or base salary. Remuneration includes all other benefits or payments, either in cash or in kind, paid directly or indirectly. So in other words, when we're discussing equal pay, which is the overall or over-encompassing term, we're also talking about the perks, from anything from cleaning uniforms to gym memberships, all right? Now, Convention 100 also identifies methods through which equal pay could be achieved. It specifically highlights national laws or regulations, legally established or recognized machineries for wage determination, collective agreements between employers and workers, or a combination of all of these. And finally, the convention promotes the use of gender-neutral or objective job evaluation methods to determine the value of a job. To date, this convention has been ratified by 173 out of ILO's 187 member states. However, despite an overwhelming 93% ratification rate of this International Labour Convention, the global gender pay gap globally still stands at 20%. So this brings me to my second question. What lies behind this gender pay gap? Why is there this 20% gender pay gap? There are different factors which explain it. These factors include gender differences in education and training, gender differences in work experience, seniority in a company, the type of industry, occupational gender segregation, full-time versus part-time work, trade union density, and company size. But these are all explained factors for the gender pay gap. However, if we control for all these factors, we look at research and we look at data. This research and data show that there is still an unexplained residual gap, which is typically attributed to discrimination. The most important causes of pay discrimination are prejudices and stereotypes, traditional job evaluation methods, remuneration systems, and bargaining power, or rather lack thereof, on the part of women in general. The continued persistence of significant gender pay gaps requires that governments, along with employers and workers' organizations and civil society, take more proactive measures to raise awareness, make assessments, promote and enforce the application of this principle of equal remuneration for work of equal value. And this brings me to my third and final question. What is the international community doing to address this global gender pay gap? In September 2017, the Equal Pay International Coalition, or EPIC, was launched to contribute to the achievement of SDG Target 8.5, which talks about equal pay. EPIC is led by the ILO, UN Women, and the OECD. It is currently the only multi-stakeholder global partnership to reduce the gender pay gap. EPIC's role is to achieve equal pay for women and men everywhere. EPIC brings together a diverse set of actors with different areas of focus and expertise to make concrete and coordinated progress towards this goal of equal pay. EPIC welcomes 6 different types of members: governments, workers' organizations, employers' organizations, private sector companies, academia, and civil society organizations. Through its research, EPIC members support each other primarily through peer-to-peer learning to make equal pay a reality and to reduce the gender pay gap. This is supported through research, data collection, advocacy, knowledge sharing, capacity building, technical advisory services, data analysis, and monitoring. To date, EPIC has organized annual technical meetings for its members on topics such as pay gap indicators, the collection of equal pay data, the development and enforcement of equal pay policies, and pay transparency measures. EPIC has also developed an equal pay database, which collects information on whether domestic and legal frameworks in over 187 member countries mandate equal remuneration or have wage transparency or minimum wage laws in place. Earlier this year, EPIC launched a community sharing portal. EPIC is particularly active on LinkedIn and Twitter. And finally, as I wrap up, just to let you know that EPIC was also instrumental in the establishment of International Equal Pay Day, which is now celebrated on September the 17th every year. And International Equal Pay Day was first established by the UN back in 2020. I'll wrap up here. Thank you so very much, Cairo. Bye.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. I am writing down some notes because I just found what you were sharing to be absolutely enlightening. And especially knowing that EPIC is working on and has already contributed to pay gap indicators and making sure that there is information that's being disseminated and distributed as it relates to these equal pay gaps that exist is incredible. And I have to say that knowing, for example, that UN Women is one of the multi-partner stakeholders for EPIC, I actually found an incredible use of an organization, I shouldn't say organization, but an interactive calculator or quiz that's called the Unpaid Care Work Quiz, created by UN Women. And I want everyone to think about, for example, what does it mean to say unpaid work. Now, please do not confuse this with leisure activities such as reading your favorite book or watching a movie or doing one of your hobbies, but instead, unpaid care work often involves housework that is not compensated, such as cooking, cleaning, water and fuel collection, childcare, or elder care. And these domestic duties are often mandated, not optional, and heavily contribute to the issue of gender wage gap. And so I couldn't help but want to tie that into what you were sharing in terms of an example of an indicator. So you can see, for example, how the quiz works. I would love for you to actually take this quiz on your own to be able to find out and calculate what your daily load looks like. So you can see, for example, that based off of the options or choices that were chosen, you'll see that the unpaid work is approximately equivalent to about 6 years. And now, you can then compare that with the global average. And then there's also a toolkit and a sort of resources for individuals to be able to take action. As you can see, the global average is about 10 years versus men's global average of 4 years of unpaid work. So with that being said, I do want to continue on with our next panelist, but I have to say that I really appreciate all that you shared with us in this area. And I'm sure that there are people who have questions to learn a little bit more, maybe about those indicators or more. If you have any questions, please remember to put them in the chat so that way we can feature you very soon. All right, our next speaker is Shannon Williams, who is the director of Equal Pay Today for the Equal Right Advocates. Shannon, I really look forward to your presentation as it relates to the mission and the vision of Equal Pay Today. Shannon, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I first want to thank the organizers of this event for having me here today. I am incredibly honored to be here with these amazing speakers and panelists for such an important conversation. I'm Shannon Williams, the director of the Equal Pay Today campaign, a project of equal rights advocates, which is an organization dedicated to advancing and protecting the rights of women and girls most impacted by gender, racial, and economic inequities for over 4 decades. The Equal Pay Today campaign, which was launched on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Federal Equal Pay Act, consists of both national and state-based organizations from all across the country who are dedicated to challenging the legal, policy, and cultural barriers at the local, state, and national level that keep women from being paid equally. Our coalition, which consists of more than 35 workers' rights, women's rights, civil rights, and legal advocacy organizations across the country, works to advance our mission to eradicate the long-standing gender and race wage gaps that impact the economic security and stability of women and families. Together as a coalition, we work to close the wage gaps that persist in nearly every industry and profession through strategies involving policy reform, litigation, public and community mobilization, advocacy, education, and outreach. Our work addresses the overlapping issues of pay inequality, occupational segregation, pay secrecy, and retaliation against workers for discussing pay, pregnancy and caregiver discrimination, workplace harassment, wage theft, and an unlivable minimum wage. And our strategies that we advance together as a coalition include engaging in public mobilization through organizing and strategic communications with a focus on young people, low-income women, and women of color, advancing policy reform by supporting and providing resources to state projects, developing an equal pay resource bank, strategic legal enforcement and advocacy, and identifying the current research available and gaps in research that we can help to fill to ensure our work is grounded firmly in data justice. When we talk about equal pay and when we say the gender wage gap, we're speaking about the gap between what men are paid versus what women are paid, and refers to the average annual pay of all women who work full-time year-round compared to the pay of men. This gap is the sizable difference in income between the average woman and the average man in our country, and this gap exists across nearly every profession, even taking into account years of experience and level of education. But even within this reality, there is a common misconception that pay discrimination is no longer a widespread issue. However, we know that even in the light of passing of federal legislation such as the Equal Pay Act and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, the wage gap has been stalled for decades. So this fight is very real and needs as much amplification as possible. And with that, one thing we are very proud to do as a coalition is observe and amplify the important message around equal pay days. Equal Pay Day, which was observed this year on Tuesday, March 15th, marks just how far in 2022 the average woman has to work to catch up to what the average man earned in 2021 alone. Earning just 83 cents for every dollar paid to the average man, women must work an extra 3.5 months to catch up with men's earnings. Because of this, the average woman stands to lose more than $10,000 every year to gender and racial pay discrimination. If the gender wage gap were eliminated, the average woman would have enough additional money every year for an additional year of childcare, 1 year of tuition and fees for a 4-year public university, or the full cost of tuition and fees for a 2-year college, more than 9 months of rent for the following year, 7 months of health insurance, more than a year's worth of food, or enough money to pay off their student loan debt in under 4 years. This is why the wage gap is so detrimental, because it does not just impact the women who are experiencing these gaps in their wages, but it impacts their families, their communities, and our country as a whole. And while we know that it takes women 15.5 months to earn what men make in just 12, this gap gets even wider when you begin to factor in race as well. For women of color who find themselves at the intersection of gender and race discrimination, the wage gap gets larger and these numbers become much worse. The effects and the impacts become compounded, ultimately resulting in keeping families in poverty and contributing to the perpetual cycles of generational poverty. The global pandemic has shined a spotlight on the economic inequities and struggles that have always plagued women, and disproportionately women of color. This is an unprecedented time where pay discrimination has put women in a position where they may not be able to recover, and the perpetuation of this discrimination in pay means consequences for women, their families, and their communities. This time also presented a huge opportunity for our coalition to address the pay disparities among groups of workers that do not always get recognized. The workers in the essential work that we all rely on to keep our society running and our economy moving are severely undervalued and underpaid. And many of these industries are dominated by women of color. They also consist of women that work part-time, migrant workers, seasonal workers, gig workers, and freelance workers. These are jobs that were previously excluded and tend to pay way less, even though, as we've seen during the pandemic, they make up some of the most essential jobs needed to keep our society running and our economy functioning properly. They are jobs that are part of the new fabric of how we now define what work looks like now. And for far too long, these workers have been excluded from equal pay data and from the conversations, despite the fact that many of them work more hours than full-time workers because they need multiple part-time jobs to keep a roof over their families' heads. 34 million women are essential workers in this country, and they are disproportionately overrepresented in the lowest paying essential fields such as food service, retail, factory garment production, teaching, daycare, and domestic work like nannying and caring for elderly or disabled people. The exclusion of these women has presented an inaccurate picture of how dire the situation is, especially for women of color. People have been underestimating the gender and race wage gap for years, and it's actually much worse than we thought. So our coalition is doubling down on raising awareness about our country's hardest working and lowest paid women. With that, our coalition, through conversations led by our partners, Justice for Migrant Women and NAPOF, we're putting forward new and more inclusive statistics that include income data for workers typically excluded from these calculations, and thus equal paid discussions as a whole, again, such as part-time, migrant workers, seasonal workers, gig workers, and freelance workers. And so while we always observe specific demographic equal pay days, in addition to Equal Pay Day, that highlight the distinct discrimination that is felt by women of color, this year, these days will be established using data that is rooted in inclusion and that is more reflective of our current workforce as it is today. Based on this new methodology, we're seeing that among the different demographics, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander women are earning just 75 cents for every dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic man, making their Equal Pay Day May 3rd. Black women are earning 58 cents for every dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic man, making their Equal Pay Day September 21st. Native American women are earning 50 cents for every dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic man, making their Equal Pay Day November 30th. And Latinas are earning just 49 cents for every dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic man, making their Equal Pay Day December 8th. With these numbers, we're looking at 17, 21, 23, and 24 months before these women catch up to what white non-Hispanic men made in just the previous year alone, a gap that will add up to nearly $1 million being stolen from them over the course of a 40-year career. In addition to highlighting and amplifying the important message surrounding equal pay days, our coalition also focuses on advancing policies and strategies that address the wage gap, while also combating the barriers that keep women from achieving equal pay. The issue of pay discrimination is not a problem that exists in a silo, and there are a number of factors that contribute to the gender and racial wage gap. One factor is occupational segregation. This refers to the fact that women and people of color are disproportionately segregated into our country's lowest paying fields. Fields that are traditionally dominated by women are undervalued and so deliberately underpaid. Occupational segregation also refers to the systematic undervaluing of jobs that are considered women's work, and is a strong contributor to the wage gap. Another factor is minimum wage. Women make up 2/3 of minimum wage earners, so our country's unlivable minimum wage is also a huge contributor to the wage gap. The minimum wage has been stalled for 13 years, while prices of rent, gas, and necessities have sharply increased. The sub-minimum wage also plays a role as well, sitting at $2.13 federally. This becomes another contributor to the wage gap in an industry that is mostly dominated by women. And as a coalition, Equal Pay Today works to advocate for and advance policies that combat these factors and that can really help to end the wage gap. Federally, we advocate for legislation like the Paycheck Fairness Act. If passed, this act would do 4 different things. It would increase pay transparency by making it illegal for employers to retaliate against workers for discussing their pay with colleagues, make it illegal for employers to ask a job applicant about their salary history, what they currently make or what they used to make. This would help to break the cycle of unfair pay because using prior pay to set new pay only allows discrimination to follow women from job to job. It would require employers to prove that pay disparities exist for legitimate job-related reasons, and it would remove obstacles for workers who want to join forces against discrimination in a class action lawsuit. And we also work to push legislation and policies in the states that address things that we know to be effective in closing the wage gap. Things like implementing pay data collection, making it illegal to ask job candidates what they currently make or what they previously made, and requiring for salary ranges to be listed and provided in job postings. And above all, as a coalition, we are working to make sure that our public policies are really centering the needs and the experiences of women of color, so that we are no longer playing catch up with their financial security. So I'll leave you today with this thought. What could happen if women were paid equally? What would our workplaces and our country look like if we were truly to value the work of women, and not just with our words, but with our actions? The fight for equal pay across all sectors is more important now than ever, and the Equal Pay Today coalition is going to remain on the front lines of this fight as we continue to work together to combat these racial and economic injustices. So I'd like to thank you again for having me today to tell you a little bit about the Equal Pay Today campaign. It's truly been a pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And I really appreciate all that you shared with us, including those statistics. Many people may not quite understand how dire it is when we are earning, cents on a dollar. Because if we are the backbone of our communities and of our societies, for example, this discrimination costs us even more, especially if we are the ones taking care of our families, our communities, and more. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And here's an interesting fact that some of you may not actually know. In July 2020, New Zealand passed the Equal Pay Amendment Bill, although it's important to note that laws already existed prior to this bill that guaranteed women and men would be paid equally for the same work. However, for this amendment bill, it's actually aimed to compensate women who are in traditionally underpaying jobs and roles so that they can be compensated fairly. So I believe that there are definitely some models for us to be able to look at as to how we can be able to contribute towards this Equal Pay Act that you have shared with us. So thank you so much. And I believe that this is actually the perfect segue to Ishan Shah, who will be speaking to us today about decent work, what that means, as well as how decent work intersects with advocating against human trafficking and climate change. Ishan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Cara. It's a pleasure to be here today, speaking alongside you all. I was actually thinking to myself as I was sort of writing some notes as what to say. I'm the only sort of young man on this panel today, so I thought I might speak a little bit more about the role of men and boys in sort of this movement, and perhaps if there's time at the end in the Q&A, I can allude to the parts about human trafficking in the context of climate change and the work we're doing around CSW 66. But I'm by no means an expert on this topic. And as an 18-year-old, I am continuously learning every day, but I do have a deep enough understanding of some of the more broader themes around gender inequalities and the gender pay gap, and also the role of men and boys within this movement. It really is no secret that gender inequalities are deeply rooted in global socioeconomic and political structures, societies, and systems. Nearly all dimensions of life have been constructed in this way, created to maintain and uphold power imbalances that really contribute to these patriarchal ideas. Gender inequality is about history, structural racism, climate change, economics, all huge topics that have hundreds of years of theories, work, data, research, and cultural context to them. And so and this has been familiar discourse for a very, very long time. In order to tackle gender inequalities, we have to see bold, systemic, and intergenerational change and action. And as a young man in this movement and this space, to me, this means committing to embarking on a lifetime of learning and listening to all women and girls, starting by ignoring the concept of what I already know, because the idea of working to a more equitable society means that we have to get used to the idea of letting go what we have been taught or what we have internalized about society. We have to allow ourselves to think past what we know and open up to what our society could be. For men and boys, gender equality and even particular topics such as equal work, equal pay, and the gender pay gap can be interesting debates or fascinating conversations or issues. But for women and girls, this is their life. Not experiencing gender inequality allows those conversations to be theoretical for men and boys, but living it and experiencing these conversations for women and girls is an entirely different theme. And this means that we have to experience temporary discomfort when learning about this, while women and girls live in it permanently. So for me, especially as a young person, it has been about listening to the people who have studied, worked, lived, and led in this field, because this is the only effective way to learn. And I will always prioritize listening to them over voicing my opinion early on. And I think it's useful here to look at broader concepts such as the patriarchy. The patriarchy and the structures that have enabled the gender pay gap and and sort of other forms of discrimination against women and girls to thrive. These may not have been things that we've picked up the tools to build, but by refusing to engage in and understand that we as men and boys benefit from them means that we are essentially fueling it and allowing it to continue unchecked. And this goes beyond gender. Recognizing intersectionalities, we either benefit or are impacted by the systems entrenched into our cultures and society every day, depending on our race, gender identity, sexuality, age, and more. So it's important for us as men and boys to do more by being aware of what structures we benefit from, and then trying our best to assist in deconstructing them. It is a process, little and often, and it is uncomfortable work. It can feel daunting and terrifying to think about deconstructing this system, but it's the only way that we will all benefit. To start, we have to try and see the inequalities we face as not unavoidable eventualities, but as structures built into societies and cultures that we can unbuild if we have the will. And this means the individual, but also the political and corporate will to do so. But we also have to look at being proactive, pick up the books, ask the questions, sign up for events like these, listen and learn. And that's essentially my motivations for being in this movement. We have to be putting ourselves in those uncomfortable spaces, leaning into it and dealing with it and continuing to do that. Inviting ourselves to think about masculinity, the patriarchy, reducing the gender pay gap. It's about unpacking what we think and why we think it. It's about having the courage to approach these conversations offline and be brave enough to see a huge problem and figure out where we fit into the solutions. Whatever you do, wherever you work, and whoever you know, you already have that immediate sphere of influence. Whether it's a colleague, a family member, or your friends, you can drive change because it's from the grassroots level that the change really stems. Now, when it comes to sort of pay and work and the invisibilities of women's work, the non-recognition of informal work, farmers, domestic workers, care workers, frontline workers in health and communities, the invisibilities of these works all contribute to unequal pay. And these economic insecurities also exacerbate vulnerabilities to forms of exploitation and trafficking in persons where we know that women and girls are disproportionately impacted. Ultimately, we have to be seeing concrete action. And as I mentioned earlier, individual, political, and corporate will, because we make up a world made and run by men. So together we do have the access to shift the culture that hurts, harms, and boxes in women and girls, taking away their choices and upholding the comfort of men and boys at the expense of others. We need to see the root causes of gender inequalities addressed, and I strongly believe that youth in all our diversity play a crucial role in facilitating this change. And this really starts at the community level. The very spaces occupied by men and boys can be used for positive progression over negative actions. And that starts by exploring these ideas ourselves, talking and questioning things. And to finish and to conclude, I want to end on a phrase that I was told a lot growing up: do the right thing when nobody's watching. And I hope that listening to this incredible panel today and engaging with each other, that you will commit and choose to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your words, Ishan. And I just have to say, I thought it was quite wonderful what you shared at the beginning, which is the fact that you are the only man on this panel and you are the youngest person here. And this is just exactly what I was alluding to earlier, the importance of intergenerational, intersectional conversation. And it's true that when we have panels like this, it's important to make sure that they are truly intersectional. Why? Because at the end of the day, we cannot be speaking to just ourselves. We need to make sure that there are allies, that there are supporters, like you said, who are actively listening and then can share that and help perhaps change the minds of some of the people who may not understand just by hearing someone like myself or some of our other panelists. It takes a young person like you as well to be able to share this message as well, so that we all impact the world. So thank you so much for sharing what you did. I truly enjoyed hearing you speak. And when Hawa shared that you were a fantastic speaker, she was not kidding at all. So thank you for that. At this time, I would now like to introduce Samira Khan, our next panelist, who is the Director of Citizenship and Market Development, AI and Sustainability at Microsoft. Samira, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Cairo. And it's difficult to speak on the heels of Ishan, just having delivered such an inspiring talk. But yeah, so I wanted to take a step back. And when we think about equal pay across genders, or we think about pay equity, we must think about it as a systems change problem. And because it's a systems change problem, it requires a diverse movement. So I wanted to unpackage that movement with you today to really make the changes that are required to move the needle on this more tangible and real. So if you think about equal pay, the definition hinges upon comparable work. And that requires there to be clarity around what comparable work is. What types of jobs require the same skill sets, what types of jobs require that you perform the same duties at work, and what types of jobs translate into similar career ladders. So you really need the data around comparable work to be available and accessible, but you also need benchmarks around pay, and you need transparency from companies as well as industries on those benchmarks. So I think oftentimes when we talk about equal pay, the onus is upon the woman or the individual to actually speak up or to negotiate differently. And one thinks that once these women are empowered with data around metrics, once they understand what comparable work is, that'll move the needle. But that's only part of the story. One really has to think about the data that needs to be available to companies and the incentives and risks that companies are dealing with to make decisions around pay, and not just around pay, but to make decisions around who is that next leader, who is the person they will promote next. So it's about empowerment around data. It's also about a culture in terms of how women are viewed. And it's also around the incentives and risks that exist for employers with legislation coming behind. So truly a systems change problem. And I know in my work, I've been focused very much on thinking about how these private companies, especially large corporations, can create mechanisms to really empower their own people to play a role in this movement to accelerate the movement across the different stakeholders groups. So you need the employees to have a certain level of agency to really operate and move the needle, as well as employers to be making very visible commitments around what equal pay looks like. So the reason I wanted to root this conversation in data is because I work in the tech sector. And I think the tech sector is instrumental to moving the needle on this space. One, because it enables us to use the data differently and to collect the data differently. But secondarily, I won't shy away from saying that the tech sector in and of itself has had significant problems with gender balance within their workforce, and certainly equal pay. And certainly as you go up the ranks, seeing the number of females that exist sort of at the highest levels of leadership, as well as certain racial groups that are represented. So there's a unique responsibility upon technology to give back to the sector, to enable the sector, and to move the needle forward on equal pay. So what data allows you to do is it allows you to create accountability structures within companies so that you can hold, hiring managers accountable for equal pay from one job to another, if you think about comparable work, but also within industries. And so when you go from company to company, you're carrying that sort of yardstick forward, but also across industries and in geolocations. So that's why I think the data piece of it and moving the needle on the measurement piece and the metrics piece, as well as the storytelling piece, is very important. Because what you'll notice when that tends to happen, when that data is available, you'll notice that by virtue of that, the women themselves are more empowered because they have the data at their fingertips. They can negotiate differently. They have other people to look to who've been through that negotiation journey. And employers will start to hold one another accountable because it'll become more transparent and visible what their outcomes are around equal pay. So it creates a foundation whereby jobs that are similar or like jobs, or jobs that require similar contributions out of one's life or out of one's sort of community are paid similarly across individuals and across communities. So I think that's really important. And yes, part of the discussion is certainly about empowering women to negotiate differently, to lead differently, to empower other women, but it is also about holding these employers, especially tech companies, accountable for giving back and doing more for the sector in this regard, and truly empowering the ecosystem. So far, I've covered this notion of education and awareness around the actual central problems, which is comparability of work and pay benchmarks, but it also involves moving the needle and influencing the hard sort of policy and legislation that is coming out of governments themselves. And it's also about the underlying technology that comes along with it. So this mindset shift and behavior shift will only happen if you're truly empowering the entire ecosystem and you're bringing all players along. And that's why I believe that technology can be a key driver in this. And so I want to take a little bit of a step back. I mentioned that companies need to invest in this space. I talked about the historic gender differences in tech and that it's a systems problem. And for tech to truly show up as a leader in society, with their missions and with their sort of visions, they have to play a role in this space. But I would like to say that pay equity does not stand alone. It does not stand on its own. It comes along with a host of other issues, challenges, and benefits for women that need to be created because of the onus of particular responsibilities that fall upon women. That was mentioned before by other speakers. So you can think about maternity as an example, and maternity leave, familial leave. So that's why it's so important to strengthen the broader movement and to not just look at pay equity in isolation as a singular issue, but to look at it as a part of a broader discussion around empowering gender in the workplace and really elevating the voice of women and women's causes across the workplace. And trying to understand the value of a particular job, what constitutes strong performance, so that once women are in these jobs, not only are they being paid equally, but they're being promoted equally. And then the perception around the individuals and the women themselves in terms of their contribution and their capabilities. And that's a very difficult thing to do. So I think that there needs to be a broader sort of platform to not just have the data around the pay equity piece, but to also elevate women as role models for one another, to truly drive that discussion, to allow technology to be a way that women are connecting with other women in allyship, to really drive this movement forward. So there's a lot more than technology can do and enable. And what I've seen from my experience within my company is that women have used employee resource groups to share data around their pay, to share jobs with one another, to have these difficult discussions. They've used technology to organize globally around these topics, even if it's something as simple as sending out around a spreadsheet where you actually put down your pay so that you're sharing one another. And that even took a lot. And I've also seen women use technology, and men and women use technology to drive forward this discussion and conversation externally around what equal pay looks like, to raise their voice, to write about it. So I wanted to also, elaborate upon a recent example. Reshma Sojani, she's put out this Marshall Plan for Moms. And what it's really calling for is the change of long overdue policies around paid family leave, affordable childcare, and pay equity. And she's really talking about it as putting the woman at the center in the US. I mean, her examples are mostly in the US, to help them realize their full economic potential. And I think Cairo mentioned this. It's really about helping a woman realize her full economic potential, because what that does is that strengthens the community and it strengthens society in a very, very different way. So I think these human movements being empowered by data and technology, easier said than done, holding technology companies as well as private sector companies, large companies with deep pockets accountable through audits, through data sharing, comparability, transparency, really can drive a system that is supported by infrastructure and informed by research and knowledge, but that is moved forward through a collective movement. So not only do women need to be prepared differently for these conversations and to show up differently in these rooms, not only does legislation have to be in place, but for that norm setting to really take shape, we have to champion female talent differently. And we have to do so in a way that it's not just about pay equity, but it's about realizing a woman's full potential and enabling women to realize their full potential and enabling every woman to do so.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Samira. And it's absolutely true that the key is really being able to recognize your full potential economically as well. I can tell you just really quickly that I have been part of women's groups, for example, where we do talk about how much we're making and what our goals are and some of the challenges that we've had either as entrepreneurs or leaders in our fields. And it's really inspiring because it allows us to remember that we're not alone in this fight. Also, it helps us to, congratulate and celebrate those who are making these stands and making these strides. So I appreciate that. And technology definitely plays a role in terms of some of the online communities that I'm a part of and online groups that exist as well. That being said, last but certainly not least, we have speaker Lina El-Kaddoumi of the United Nations Global Compact. The UN Global Compact is a voluntary initiative that holds companies accountable for their sustainability by creating principles on human rights, labor, the environment, and more. And over 15,000 companies are part of this compact, but I'll let Lina go ahead and take the floor. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Cairo, and thank you to the organizers. It's an honor to be here today. First of all, good evening from Kuwait. My background is in civil society movements and working specifically on youth empowerment. So I'm happy to be here at the nexus of women's empowerment and youth empowerment. I have a presentation that I would like to share. if possible. Okay, would you prefer I share the presentation?
I can share it for you. You just let me know which slides to go next now.
Okay, yeah, because I don't think I have the option. Okay, so I'm the Gender Equality Manager at the UN Global Compact, and the UN, oh wait, actually. So our work is informed by this quote. You can go to the next slide. By the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, where he says, gender inequality is the overwhelming injustice of our age and the biggest human rights challenge we face. And we really, identify strongly with this quote, and it really informs a lot of our programming, because we believe that as long as there is gender inequality, then, it will be hard pressed to solve any other major issue we're seeing in the world today. Next slide. So at the current rate of progress, the economic gender gap will take 267 years to close. Before COVID, this number was actually 257 years, so we're actually regressing. Next slide. And some of the structural barriers that we see that hinder women from having equal pay and equal economic opportunities. This is a non-conclusive list, but some of the things is sexual harassment. Over 25% of women have experienced sexual harassment. And of those, 46% say that it's caused them to leave their employers or even switch careers. As we all know, support for working parents is really lacking. 43% of highly qualified women with children are leaving careers or off-ramping because they simply can't afford to pay for care. Equal pay, of course, the topic of the day is huge. It stands about 20% globally. I come from a country where it's closer to 40%. So this topic really hits home for me, and unconscious bias from managers, as well as lack of work-life balance, which we've all experienced. Next slide. But we, as the eternal optimists, believe that the current crisis, or crises, I should say, provide a rare chance to disrupt gender stereotypes. It's an opportunity to show leadership, and that leadership and decision-making should be a shared responsibility across men and women. And we should build back together for and better. Next slide. So what is the UN Global Compact? So the United Nations Global Compact was founded in the year 2000 by the former Secretary General Kofi Annan. And it's the largest corporate sustainability initiative around the world. And we focus on 4 areas: human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. We have a participant base of 15,000 businesses and over 3,000 non-business members that come from civil society, labor organizations, and academia. We have representation in over 150 countries around the world and 69 local offices. And of these 18,000 participants, we're covering 72 million employees around the world. Next slide. So these are the 10 principles. I'm not going to go through them because I think we're running a little bit behind, but I'd just like to draw your attention to the labor principle 6, the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. This is where we focus on our equal pay initiative. Next slide. So what we do within the gender equality team is we prioritize gender equality as a key component of corporate sustainability and business contribution to the sustainable development goals. And what that means is we really see that gender equality is cross-cutting across the 4 issue areas: human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And so we adopt a holistic approach to gender equality, understanding the corporate impacts across the workplace, the marketplace, and the community, which I'll discuss in more detail in a bit. And we're always encouraging companies to set and meet concrete targets for women's representation and leadership in business. Next slide. So we do this through the women's empowerment principles, which were established by the UN Global Compact and UN Women in the year 2010. What is the Women Empowerment Principles? It serves as really a guide for all businesses, regardless of size, of sector, or of geography, on how to empower women in the workplace, the marketplace, and in the community. So there are 7 principles to the that are under the WEPs. And the first 4 are really about the workplace interventions that need to take place to really achieve gender equality. And then 5, 6, and 7 cover the marketplace and the community dimensions. The WEPs are grounded in international labor and human rights standards, and they recognize that businesses have a stake in and a responsibility for gender equality and women's empowerment. So to date, 12 years later, we have more than 6,300 CEOs that have signed a statement of support for the WEPs. Next slide. So one of the key components of the WEPs is the WEPs gender gap analysis tool. This is a free tool that anybody can use. Any of the civil society organizations or private sector participants on the call with us today can go on our website, and I can share the link after my presentation. And this tool is great because it's anonymous. We don't even see it from the back end. We see aggregate results. But it's a great diagnostic tool that you can really take to your HR department or to your sustainability department or to your bosses and say, you know, this is where we stand really when we look at these different indicators. And so it's a very simple tool as well. It's only 18 questions, and it looks at what are the practices and policies in the company that in 4 areas: on leadership, on workplace, marketplace, and in community. And we encourage businesses and nonprofits to take this tool every year to 2 years to really establish the baseline, and then, you know, set targets based on, you know, where the business is at. Next slide. So just to preface this slide by saying that most companies that start are usually at a beginner level or intermediate level. Companies do not tend to score very highly on the WEPs gender gap analysis tool, which just means that there's a lot of room for progress and a lot of room for growth. So what we do every 2 years, we publish a report where we look at the aggregate findings of the gender gap analysis tool submissions around the world. So this year, we just released our latest report on March 8th on International Women's Day, and I can share that as well in the chat after my presentation. And what we did is we looked at regional trends this time. So we were interested in seeing, you know, what were the overwhelming themes in the Asia Pacific region versus Africa versus Middle East, and so on and so forth. So some of the key findings, first of all, the people who or the companies that have filled out this tool, 47% are either micro, small, or medium enterprises, and they span 117 countries. So globally, companies' average score from using the tool has increased actually from 2020, the last time we published the report. So it went from 28% to 32%. So there's definitely been progress, but where we see progress the most is companies who have committed to gender equality by establishing targets and you know, announcing these targets. 32% of respondents regularly undertake a gender pay gap audit or evaluation, which is, in my opinion, very low, and 18% publicly disclose the gender pay gap. Next slide. So I've also included, in case anyone's interested, how different regions fare. Yes, I just saw the question in the chat. The WEPs does include the voice of civil society. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some of you might be asking, why should I sign the WEPs? Why should I take the gender gap analysis tool? Okay, I know this information, then what do I do with it? what the UN Global Compact offers its participants, civil society and businesses, is a lot of tools online, a lot of training programs, a lot access to peer learning opportunities as well. So some of the tools that are available today to participants is advancing gender equality through employer-supported childcare, closing the gender pay gap, and then how COVID-19 has affected women and how can business mitigate that. And these are all included in the UN Global Compact Academy. For non-members of UN Global Compact, we also have a lot of free tools that are available on our website, and I would encourage you to take it. We're actually about to publish a tool on decent work for sustainable procurement, which I'll talk about in a bit. Next slide. Okay, so another add-on to joining the Global Compact is we have a lot of events as well. So we just wrapped up our annual gender flagship event, which is the Target Gender Equality Live. We have CEO roundtables all the time with leaders in gender equality reform. We also have the Global Compact Leader Summit, which is on June 1st and June 2nd, among other different avenues for collaboration. Next slide. We also have other initiatives. One of them is the panel pledge, which I really love. It's a very simple, low-hanging fruit where we encourage members of the Global Compact to say no to speaking on all female or all male panels. I think it's really important to understand kind of the ramifications of an audience and of young people looking up to these panels and seeing that they're, all men and then the token woman. It's a real issue. Next slide. Oh, I don't know what happened here, but we're also part of coalitions with different UN agencies. So one of them is EPIC, which my colleague Lisa discussed already, the Equal Pay International Coalition, as well as the Women's Entrepreneurship Accelerator, where we're in a multi-stakeholder partnership with 6 different UN agencies: the ILO, ITC, ITU, UNDP, and UN Women. And the aim of the Women Entrepreneurship Accelerator program is to empower more than 5 million women entrepreneurs by 2030. And we do this really collaboratively. We work on programs together, and we also highlight what other UN agencies are doing in support of women entrepreneurs. Next slide. We're also involved in the Ring the Bell event that happens annually at over 100 exchanges around the world. Next slide. And our biggest event, or our biggest offering, I would say, as the gender team, is the Target Gender Equality Accelerator program, which basically its aim is to set ambitious targets, or we ask corporations to set ambitious targets for women's business leadership. So we've done this for the last 2 years, and we're about to kick off our 3rd year. And we've done it in 80 countries so far. And basically the call to action here is to teach companies, walk them through how to set ambitious targets and what needs to take place for these targets to be actualized. So we don't believe that you just focus on women in leadership without focusing on doing an equal pay audit, looking at how you're supporting families and so on and so forth. Next slide. So more on the accelerator program, it calls for gender balance in business leadership, starting with the board and executive management level. It drives business action to support SDG 5. And then it directly supports the implementation of the Women's Empowerment Principles, the WEPs, which guide all businesses on how to advance gender equality. Next slide. We really believe that it's important to have women on leadership positions and on decision-making tables to advance corporate sustainability and achieve the SDGs. We see that there's resounding evidence to prove that if there's high female participation, there would be an annual return of 2.8 percentage points higher for the company. And women's business leadership is linked to better ESG performance, including reduced greenhouse gas emissions and stronger worker relations. Next slide. So these are all the countries that, I don't know why it's formatted this way, I'm so sorry, but these are all the countries that we've already had target gender equality in. Next slide. So the Target Gender Equality Live, the flagship event I was talking about, it happened on March 15th, and we had about 3,200 participants from around the world, and they were representing over 1,800 organizations. And we had incredible speakers that came from Afghanistan, from the Middle East, from all across Africa, and we looked at the workplace, the marketplace, and the community dimension of really implementing gender equality initiatives from a private sector lens. Next slide. Next slide. And then I just want to quickly close by announcing that our new commitment is to the marketplace dimension. So we've focused a lot through Target Gender Equality on driving businesses to set targets for women in advancing women in leadership. Now what we've been doing, based on actually the WEP's gender gap analysis tool, is looking at what businesses can do to intervene in the marketplace. So placing the onus on business to say, okay, where are your targets? Why aren't you looking at how much money you're spending on women-owned businesses, for example? How can we better include women in global supply chains? You know, the supply chains are the hot topic now. So I think, again, having more inclusive supply chains makes supply chains more sustainable as well. Next slide. So some of the key features in this work is we are, again, supporting businesses in boosting their corporate commitments, in supporting women-led businesses and entrepreneurs by amplifying the business case for action, and there is definitely a strong business case. We're also supporting companies in establishing and expanding supplier diversity programs and identifying innovative approaches to support women's entrepreneurship and supplier development. So taking a more proactive role in not just procuring from women-owned businesses, but working with your existing suppliers to have them be more gender responsive in their own business practices, regardless of whether the business ownership is male or female. We're also aiming to scale existing best practices and elevate the work of partner organizations, such as the ILO, as UN Women, as ITU, and so on and so forth, and encourage collaboration between key corporate functions. So it's not something that is specifically the role of the procurement team to procure from women-owned businesses or gender-responsive businesses, but it's also one of the responsibilities of the diversity, equity, inclusion departments and the sustainability department. We also are contributing to policy dialogue and advocating for gender-responsive procurement globally, and advocating for businesses to raise the bar on public reporting and accountability on, you know, where they are with their target setting. And I think very importantly, tell the story of women-owned businesses and entrepreneurs. I think there's a big role in, or there's a lot of value in seeing the face and the stories of women entrepreneurs and bringing their businesses into the limelight. I think that's it. Next slide. So these are my lovely colleagues, and I included our information. I'm sorry the formatting is a little bit off, but thank you so much for listening to the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Nina. And just so you know, it's not about the formatting, it's about the content. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I have to share that, especially with the WEP gender gap analysis, using that as a tool, it's really wonderful to be able to highlight or identify some of these companies who recognize, for example, maybe we're missing the mark And by addressing these targets, it actually connects back to what Samira was saying in terms of using technology as a tool for transparency and accountability. So I really appreciate you helping to tie all of that together. That being said, I have to say that I am so thoroughly impressed with all of our speakers' presentations, and I can only imagine some of the questions that you have, and I've already been seeing some of the questions, so thank you. But from listening to our speakers speak so powerfully, if you have any more questions, just know that we're going to actually begin the Q&A portion now. So that being said, I have some questions here with me, and I will now read the name and the organization of the first question posed for today's speakers. Now, that being said, before I ask this person to speak, do you still want to pose a question to our esteemed panelists? It's not too late. Just remember that you just have to simply write in the chat your name, your organization, and your question. I would now like to ask if Ana Maria Cornejo could please unmute herself to ask the question that she has. Thank you. Hi there, you're still unmuted. Are you still muted? Here, I'm going to go ahead and let's see. Can you mute? Are you here?
Thank you. I wasn't allowed to unmute, but thank you so much, Cairo, and your panel, all the panelists for this wonderful presentation. So the question I posted in the chat was regarding the lack of data of unpaid work for women in the GPD. Sorry, I'm just going to go back to properly asking this. Sorry, in the GDP, yes, exactly. So my question is, again, the unpaid work of women is not included in the GDP. What policies can economies develop or governments develop or implement to change this? And the information I used was from this wonderful book, Invisible Women, by Carolyn Criado Perez. And the reason why I brought this question and the importance, as far as I understand, is and I'm just going to read here, the upshot of failing to capture all these data is that women's unpaid work tends to be seen as a costless resource to exploit, writes economics professor Sue Himmelwhite. And so when countries try to rein in their spending, it is often women who end up paying the price. The problem is these cuts are not so much as savings as shifting of costs from the public sector onto women, because the work still needs to be done. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to ask the question.
You're absolutely welcome. And would any of our panelists be so kind as to unmute yourself and to be able to answer the question that Anna so wonderfully posed?
Cairo, I don't mind. This is Lisa here. I don't mind taking a little shot at that one. And thank you, Anna Maria, for this question. And I don't know if this helps any, but earlier this month, on the 8th of March for International Women's Day, the ILO launched a report on care at work. And this report provides like a global overview of national laws, practices regarding care policies. And the overwhelming conclusion of this research is that the way forward is for countries, governments, to invest in, countries, governments, enterprises, everyone, to invest in transformative care policy packages. And these transformative care policy packages need to be rights-based and gender responsive. They need to be integrated, universal, based on solidarity, representation, and social dialogue. And that they should also embrace a sort of a life cycle approach and comprise policies and services ranging from care leave and breastfeeding entitlements to childcare, long-term care services for all workers with family responsibilities. I mean, I know it's not specifically on unpaid care work, but I mean, it deals more with, care in general. I mean, I don't know if that helps, and perhaps some of my other panelists would like to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Were there any other comments or responses to the question that Anna Maria had? Okay, all right, fantastic. I would now like to ask if Poonam Wook, and if I mispronounced your name, please excuse me, of the All Indian Human Rights Association, if you could please unmute yourself. You may now unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity, firstly. So my question to the panelist is that while talking about the gender pay gap, how far we have come across the LGBTQ rights, that is transgender. All we have been discussing is about the women rights and the women role, the kind of gap they are facing. But what about the transgenders? Thank you.
That is a fantastic question. Does anyone have any insight as it relates to the LGBTQI community and this intersection? I think that is a fantastic question. If you would be so kind as to repost it at the bottom of the chat, and then I will be able to follow back up with you as we go through the rest of our questions. We'll give our panelists some time to marinate on that question. The next question that I have is from Linda Davis, specifically to Samira. Linda Davis, let me go ahead and unmute you. You should be able to speak now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for letting me ask this question. So I was listening to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, talking the other day about a situation where a man and woman went into a bank to get credit, and she was given a lower credit amount than her husband. And so even though her income was higher. And when they pursued and asked, why is this? It was the algorithms in the system that perpetuated this, that indicated that she was not allowed to get a higher credit, even though she earned more money than her husband. And so, we run into this, especially in social media, where the technology and the numbers and the algorithms are perpetuating the system this inequality that we deal with on a day-to-day. And so how can we make those changes? How can we change the algorithms to not be what they are, but what we want? So not to reflect the society that exists today, but the society we want to exist. So just to whoever, I had said to Samira, but
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. And, it shows up not just in the domain of equal pay, but shows up in many other domains as well. And the fundamental sort of issue is the either lack of data or the quality of data, and the sort of infrastructure and pools that it currently exists to collect that data are biased. So they are either located in certain geographies or disproportionately are taking into consideration input from particular populations and not other populations. So if the data doesn't exist and those designing are working with faulty data, then these sort of outcomes and frameworks you're getting can be faulty in some way. So that's part of it. Second is just who's actually behind designing these frameworks. That's a question to be asked. If the team is not diverse and not conscious of these gaps and doesn't have the awareness and education, then these gaps emerge as well. So better educating designers is something that's really important, and those designing the technology. So I know it's an important value at Microsoft to really deepen the education of our workforce around these topics so that they're designing in things differently and they're placing a more critical eye on the data that they're receiving. Now, closing that data gap is not going to be overnight. I think it's going to take years of investment in collecting data on particular communities, in really making sure that that data is scrutinized, the existing data is scrutinized and used differently. So I think that's part of it. And I guess one particular group I would like to call out is with whom we need to work better is just academia, because they're trying to do cutting edge research in this space. And as they sort of shift and have more of an eye toward diversity and inclusion, I think working closely with them will enhance the work of those designing products and those designing algorithms. But I know we have limited time, so I'll just pause there.
Thank you so much, Samira. And Poonam, just so you know, Shannon would like to take your question. She was trying to unmute herself just in time. And so that being said, I'd like to reroute so that your question can be answered. Thank you for posing it, Poonam.
Yeah, so I just wanted to try and offer a little something for that question. So in the United States as it stands right now, we don't really have solid data on how the LGBTQ, non-binary or trans folks are really impacted by the pay gap. And we as advocates are recognizing this is a huge problem across our country that we're really working to address. Just for a little background, the data that we use to calculate the wage gap comes from ACS and CPS Census Bureau data. And in the census, we ask people to give their sex, but not their gender. And so while the census does provide a comprehensive overview, it really doesn't account for like gender identity and disability or LGBTQI plus status. Because we recognize this and we know that it's so hard to fix things without data, you can't fix what you can't see. We're really advocating for the amplification around this. So in addition to the equal pay days that we have and that we're observing across the different demographics, we also have an LGBTQI plus equal pay awareness day that we highlight. And because again, we don't have the data, so we can't set an actual equal pay day. We use it and amplify it during June, which is Pride Month here. So we're trying to advocate for everything that we can to make sure that we have this data so that we can actually fix this issue and work on closing that gender wage gap amongst the LGBTQI plus community, which we know exists as well.
Thank you so much for that, Shannon. And I have to say that when I was on the website for the Equal Pay today, I saw that, for example, that Awareness Day did exist. And I love the way that it's set up. I really encourage everyone to go on the website and to see, for example, the different days that exist and why they're being celebrated, as well as some of the statistics to support that as well. So thank you so much, Shannon. And with that being said, I believe I see another question. I have Hannah Shono. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you to all the organizers and all the panelists for this fantastic event. So some of the factors that contribute to the gender pay gap are issues like race, disability, age, education, and so on. I believe has been highlighted at the event today. And while the economy is affected by the gender pay gap, could you also say that the economy itself, and by that I mean our current economic structure that arguably doesn't necessarily serve us as much as we serve the system, is also a factor that contributes to the problem. And I also wonder if afterwards, if Ishan could also speak briefly about gender equality and human trafficking. Thank you.
I think for the sake of time, I'm going to ask Ishan, would you be willing to take the second part of that question in terms of that intersection, please?
Of course, yes. So one of the root causes and enablers of modern slavery and human trafficking today is gender inequality. And that's because the way that human traffickers work is to exploit vulnerabilities and exploit power imbalances. And the most comprehensive data suggests that 1 in every 130 women and girls globally is in some form of modern slavery. And of course, one of those driving factors is economic vulnerabilities and economic precarity, which again is exacerbated by things like sort of lack of access to decent work, but also factors like climate change. And so one of the things that we're doing at the moment in the context of CSW 66 is, as global youth, we're working directly with member states, for the first time, engaging with them and influencing negotiations of the agreed conclusions and outcomes. And for those who are following CSW 66 negotiations closely, you'll realize that the methods of work for the first time in CSW history include language around youth, which is absolutely incredible, but also that every revised text that we've seen being produced and published by the facilitator is incorporating more language that we as youth are suggesting and recommending to member states. And one of the things that I'm focusing on as well in the context of CSW 66 is, again, this crucial link between decent work, sort of access to decent economic opportunities, but also the ways that climate change are impacting and exacerbating existing vulnerabilities, but also creating new vulnerabilities, which again, put women and girls at disproportionate risk to trafficking in persons and contemporary forms of slavery. Yeah, that's a very brief response to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Hannah, for posing your question. I'm going to take just 2 questions now. The second to last question, Emmy Shitara, if you can please unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hello, this is Emi Shitara from Japan, and thank you so much. I really appreciate. And my question is mainly for the UN Global Compact and how women entrepreneurs can enter UN Global Compact Committee. And if I'm just curious if webs include voice of civil society, because we often discuss local Japan issues. And we found that webs in Japan is very a key change agent. Yeah. So thank you for your advice.
Thank you, Emmy, for your question. I saw it and I was actually drafting a response. Now I'm just catching up on the chat. But basically, we invite women business owners to apply to become members of the UN Global Compact. Participation is very simple, and it's basically just requires a commitment from the senior executives of your business. If you are, if you have a very small leadership team, then that's even better to get buy-in. But I'll also share my email. So if you have any issues to register, but basically we're just beginning our work on support for women entrepreneurs and improving alignment with the large buyers, the multinationals around the world. So I would encourage you also to sign up for our bulletin, the Target Gender Equality Bulletin, which I'll also share the link to in the chat. Thank you for your question. And I would encourage you also to get in touch with UN Global Compact Japan. We have a very active local network based in Tokyo.
Thank you so much for asking that question, Emmy, because that was personally a question that I had. I wanted to see how I could get involved. So thank you so much. The last question that I will provide here is by Emma Schopmeyer, which is, what are the concrete courses of action? Well, actually, before I read the question, Emma, let me go ahead and make sure that you're unmuted so I can. Yes, let me go ahead and have you ask your question. Excuse me.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Firstly, I'd like to thank our amazing panel of speakers. This has been incredibly informative and productive, and I really enjoyed hearing your varied perspectives. And I'd also like to thank you for sharing the interactive video addressing unpaid care work around the globe. I think it's a particularly salient point in the broader conversation of gender inequality, given the reality of the feminization of the informal economy and the lack of protections surrounding such work, which ultimately produces a multitude of consequences for women, from increased susceptibility to violence and discrimination, to financial insecurity and poorer health. And we understand that there is a need to raise awareness on the factors underlying the gendered nature of unpaid care work, and also to integrate a more gender equality approach to such relevant policies. But my question is, what are the concrete courses of action that civil society actors, and specifically youth, should prioritize in advancing equitable economic opportunities in the formal sector for women, as well as in implementing protections for women working in the informal economy? Thank you.
Fantastic question. Thank you so much, Emma. And let's see, who would like to be able to answer that from our panel?
I can take a go. As I mentioned in sort of earlier in my intervention, that I'm not an expert in this issue very much, but I do know a little bit about what we as youth can do. One thing we're doing is directly engaging with our own, member states and pushing for legislation in the national context, but also, when these various topics occur in the international settings, for example, at CSW, really bridging those intersections. But I think as youth, we tend to have a lot of the solutions, but we need to have those intergenerational partnerships to actually adopt them and enact them. And I think that's where it's really useful to build connections with civil society organizations and with other stakeholders, including the ILO and Global Compact and various partners who can support us in really translating, our ideas and visions, which are generally quite tangible and quite bold and very transformative in themselves, but actually into practices which can make a difference. But yeah, I'm sure some of my sort of fellow panelists here can probably answer a bit better than what I just given.
Is there anyone else who would like to share one of our panelists? You know, I'd like to say this just in closing, that being a part of the Youth Representative Steering Committee and being a part of this committee with Hawa being our advisor is an example of that intergenerational solution that you're talking about, because we get to work side by side with DGC staff as it relates to putting together events. Our voices are heard, they're respected, and we get to roll up our sleeves and actually do the work as well as it relates to managing, planning, and also executing different initiatives. And so me being here is an example of that. And I just want to, again, thank Hawa and so many of the staff for even allowing me to be here. And I can't believe that our time is already closed. It's amazing to know that there were so many amazing questions that people had posed in the chat. Please know that we appreciate you being here and participating. And we want to know, what were your thoughts? We'd like to get your feedback. So I believe Judith has already been working really hard to make sure that everyone is seeing the survey after this briefing. Please take the time. Your voices matter. And that's really what we wanted to share here, is the importance of our voices and our perspectives coming together to make a collective impact. And so your feedback helps us to have events like this and to even bigger and better. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank again Lisa Wong Ramser, Shannon Williams, Ishan Shah, Samira Khan, and Lina Al-Qadumi for being here. I just want to share with you, I'm really curious to know what your takeaways were from today's panel. And I know for me, what really stood out to me was this conversation or topic of discrimination, and especially gender-based discrimination. And I have to say that being a part of events like this, where there are resources, there are conversation, and there are reminders, for example, that there is work that is being done, it inspires me every single day. And so at this time, I'd actually like to transition into some of the upcoming events that we have here, from a youth's perspective, before turning it over to DGC staff to close. So as I was saying before, in terms of the discrimination, but going from feeling helpless and hopeless when dealing with discrimination based off of my ethnicity or gender-based, I realized that my voice and my impact can really be able to make a change. And I've used these experiences to create my own conference, Operation Stop Cyber Harassment, which is against cyber harassment and bullying as it relates to discrimination. And I'll share some information about that, but that's happening. We have other events that are coming up. So for example, the International Youth Conference that's happening in partnership with United Nations Global Communications on March 25th through the 27th. And United Nations Global Communications Civil Society Unit is one of the partners for this incredible event. So you can see what IYC5 is, and you can go ahead and register. I believe that there will be some information in the chat in order to ensure that you're able to make the 25th. And there will be over 10,000 registrants throughout this 24-hour plus event. And speaking of using storytelling and technology to inspire change on an individual level, we have a youth interview series called Storytelling with a Purpose. It's a civil society, youth-led and youth-focused interview series created with the aim of sharing how civil society is taking action to create a sustainable future as a way to inspire others and to benefit our world. I had the honor of interviewing for the first episode, Aya Shebi, who is the first youth envoy to the African Union, and I will be sure to share that in the chat as well. But it's so important that we see the ways in which we can use technology to spread the word as to how people are making an impact, especially on the ground, and then connecting them with the Sustainable Development Goals. I also have to share that we'll be releasing our second episode soon, where Renor Yani, who's my co-host, he'll be interviewing Alicia Sanders-Zach on nuclear disarmament. So although this interview was already planned and recorded months prior, we believe that this is a timely episode. So please stay tuned for more information. Before I turn it back over to the DGC staff, just want to remind you again to please take the DGC survey at the end of the event. And for more information, please contact Hawa Diallo at diallo9@un.org. I have to say, everyone, my name is Kyra Eubanks, and it was an honor being your moderator for today's event. I believe that we should not just use today's event just as a briefing, but to really find a way to take action, to bring awareness to these issues, and to be a part of the solution. Briefings like this remind me of the work that is being done to combat this issue of this gap, and I hope that you leave this briefing feeling a lot more inspired, more action-focused, and even more committed to contributing to the solution. With that being said, I turn it back over to DGC staff and Hawa to close officially. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Cairo. I wasn't expecting to get the floor back because you're doing such a fantastic job. I mean, I'm totally inspired. And as you've been talking, I've been thinking, I right after this session, I have another CSW session, and then I'm jumping on Amtrak to go to Cambridge, to Boston, to do the International Youth Conference. And I'm thinking, you know, as we're talking and bringing up all these gender-related issues, just how we are integrating gender into that very amazing conference of over 10,000 young people online, really dedicated and committed to climate action. But today for me has been so refreshing. It's really been a great discussion. No doubt the speakers did not disappoint, and neither did you, Cairo. I want to thank everybody that's been here on this platform. I think we've gotten so much fresh and new information of things that are happening that, you know, I personally didn't know about. I'm really happy to learn about the tools, the apps that were shared. And people have been asking in the chat because they're so inspired, you know, are we going to share the tape? Are we going to share these resources? So please rest assured that right after the session is finished, we will upload the session onto the DGC Civil Society website. And we'll also, you know, the speakers willing graciously include all the resources on the website and all as well. I don't want to take up more time because it's really been a packed morning. I just hope that we can come together again. I don't know, Lisa, Shannon, for gender equal pay 2.50, I don't know, because I think it's a topic that I really want to learn more about. And from what I've been seeing in the chat, it's really been buzzing. So definitely we welcome everybody back to this platform and to see, you know, if there are other things we need to dissect and handle on this topic. Thank you, Cairo, for mentioning the story with telling with a purpose youth interview series that was just posted, and I see some of the resources are being put up. So please remember to go to www.un.org/civil society to get more information about this session and all the other interesting work that we do in collaboration with our partners. Thank you so much, everybody, from wherever you're beaming in from. Keep staying connected with us and keep collaborating with us. I really appreciate you spending your time with us. On behalf of the Department of Global Communications and all the magnificent speakers on this platform and my fantastic team behind the scenes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, and hope to see you again. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.